Hi, everybody. Hi. All right, we got some energy in here. I'm Shannon Snowden. I'm Senior Technical Architect. I'm with our Tech Alliance team. And this is
Mike Nelson. I'm a cloud architect on the CSP side, on the provider side. So.
And what else?
I'm also a Microsoft MVP in Cloud and Data Center.
So who's getting all the Azure questions? All right, another question. Who's in here for certification track? Okay, Aaron, it's working. All right, so thanks for showing up.
How's ZertoCon going for everybody?
How's it going for you?
Yeah? You got a big party tonight. Telling you, man, it's going to be a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. If you haven't seen the Masters of Disaster, they're actually very surprising. Last year they played for the first time. There were a bunch of Zerto people, and they're very good. So it's an interesting thing. They're all spread out, and they sort of practice over Skype and stuff. So it's a pretty cool thing. All right, so let's get started. Here's a buzzword, actually two: digital and transformation. So if you saw the last session, which if most of you are doing the certification piece, then you saw the last session, right? Who saw the last session? All right, so you saw that world of opportunity in Azure. There was so many things in it that you can do that it can kind of be overwhelming. But what we're going to do in this session is break it down to what you actually need to have, what you need to know to get going with Zerto in Azure. So who's working with Azure currently? Oh, cool. Who's working with Zerto in Azure?
Wow.
Oh, okay. So there's going to be some review in this section because it is a cert session. But we are going to, cross your fingers, go into a live environment on wireless. So everybody stop your emailing and everything. So I'll have some bandwidth left.
We're going to tell you all to hold your breath when we go there.
That's right. So digital transformation, the whole concept of it is what we're all living as infrastructure people of going from the safe confines of a data center. I know exactly how to do my data center. I know how to control my data center. And now Azure comes along and they've got more than fits on a slide of services and things I could consume in Azure. And I've got to try to learn all that. So a good transition for you to transform, like I'm pulling these in, right? Transform your digital footprint over into the cloud is with Zerto. So a great thought that I stole from our sales kickoff was from an IBM presenter who brought up Netflix. It's the perfect digital transformation thing to put in your mind. What did Netflix start out as? DVDs. And so they had a DVD, they got into shipping model. And so they were doing physical shipping. And I think, by the way, you can still get Netflix DVDs, can't you? So, but who does that? But now they're much more of a streaming company, and they're an original content company. So that's a tremendous transformation from literally physical things to digital assets, right? So you may have heard that one before if you've been in an IBM presentation, but I do give them credit. I stole that one. So that's digital transformation. Let's talk a bit about the architecture of Azure itself. When, as you saw a similar slide to this in the last session, there's a lot of stuff that they offer. The DNS there now is really cool, so I can get out of the DNS business. There's also like the endpoint services such as SQL and things of that nature. So once you're there, there's a lot of things you can consume and have a lot of fun with. But what we like to do, and then we're going to do in this session, is break it down to, okay, that's great, but for the ones that didn't raise your hand working with Zerto in Azure already, here's what you actually need to know to get started. And these things are compute, storage, networking, and security.
Right. So in order to understand that a little bit better, Shannon's actually going to jump over here. But what you have to look at is, if you think of this is kind of like the core, right? If you think about it, you need to look at things like compute. I don't know if you remember from the last session, he had shown a whole bunch of different instance sizes. And different, within those instance sizes, you had different numbers of CPUs, you had different IOPS, you had different number of disks, you had all kinds of options that you have within just compute. But when you go over to storage, you have the same type of of options. You have, the blob storage, you have the premium manage, you have the managed disk, you have the standard, you have LRS and GRS and all kinds of different options. Okay, you also have basic restrictions when you deal with the compute and storage together. On a compute object, you may have a restriction that you can only have so many IOPS. You can only have a certain type of storage with that instance. And the same goes with networking, number of VNets, number of VNICs. All that kind of things has to be taken into consideration when you're working with something like Zerto up in Azure. Okay? And we can show you right here what it looks like inside of Azure and the things that you need to look at. What you just saw on the screen with those core components really translates right into Azure.
Yeah, so let's start with one of the core components. Let's start with virtual networks. So here's a bunch of virtual networks and a bunch of resource groups. So I just mentioned resource group. Mike, what's a resource group?
What is a resource group? Well, what a resource group, if you think about it, it's just an organizational unit, if you will, okay, from the basic level. You're basically putting things inside of a resource group. All these things can tie together and talk to each other within a group, okay? And you think of it as an organizational unit, but there are certain caveats, there are certain restrictions, there are certain options and features that are only within a resource group.
Very good. And they're typically by region. Let's talk about a region.
Sure. So when you talk about resource groups can be put into regions, okay? And I think you talked about this a little bit in the session prior. They talked about having 50 regions worldwide. Mm-hmm. And with regions, you talk about different areas of, they're actually geolocations. Okay, that's what a region is. It's around a geolocation. And what they do is they take these geolocations and they classify them into regions. Okay, so you have, besides other identity locations such as government, okay, then you have geolocations that are in different parts of the world. All right?
So if we look at the regions, if I'm putting locations here, so some of the locations that we've got are in different, essentially, regions. So we've got East US 2. You said there were, what, 50 of them?
Yep, there's 50 of them.
And for the like Germany, that's a separate one.
Correct.
The ones that
government.
have the data. Yeah.
Yep. Government is a separate one. Yep.
So if you need to keep those in that location, you certainly can. Now, what that builds for you is just an aside. So last version Zerto released the feature of going region to region inside of Azure. So once you're in Azure, you can go between those regions to protect what VMs are running in one region to go to another. So that's sort of a little addition.
Yeah, it really is. When you talk about things that allow to go to region, it's actually you started getting involved in VNet peering, as they call it, right? Mm-hmm. So you have the ability to take virtual networks and peer them together and make it look like a single network. Okay, so you have the ability to take I could take a network that I create in US Central and peer it with a network I create over in the UK and make it seem like a single network.
Yeah, and what's great about that is you don't have to do actually VPN and all
Correct.
that.
No VPNs, no anything. You just do VNet peering.
So it really opens up the world of possibilities once you're in there. And we'll talk about how to get in there easier. And how many have done the Azure Lab so far? How many are doing it after this session? Okay, so it's about half an hour. So if you've done it, you'll go through the process of installing a marketplace VM, which is our ZCA, the Zerto Cloud Appliance. But we'll also show you another way if you want to push one button and just make it all go. All right, so I'm inside a resource group that's inside of the region of, I think this was Central.
I think it was Central.
Yeah.
Central.
What are some of the things that are, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but inside of this, we've got a couple of networks. We've got the public IP address. Mike, talk about the public IP address.
Right, so the things that are inside of a resource group, specifically we're going to talk about resource groups in general, but we also talk about what Zerto puts inside. Because when you deploy a ZCA, it actually creates a resource group where you can put it into an existing resource group. And what it does is it creates several objects inside of that. Each resource group contains resource objects. Okay, and one of those is going to be like Shannon just said, the public IP. You'll assign a public IP, it'll be an object inside of that resource group. The VM will be an object. The storage will be an object. Okay, what we call the NSG, which is the Network Security Gateway, or if you want to, it's a load balancer / firewall that provides you all the firewall rules. Okay? Those are all objects that are put inside of that resource group. And specifically around Zerto, we have a specific set that every time you deploy a ZCA, it puts those objects in those groups.
Yeah. So going back to the blue slide that we saw before, you know, we're talking about the compute. So I need to spin up a ZCA inside a resource group, inside a region. So now I've got the compute piece taken care of. Let's talk about machine sizes. So our default machine size is
A DS3_V2.
which was a general purpose, if you remember from the last
Correct.
session. By the way, for a pop quiz on the last session, what was the percentage of VMs that are Linux running in Azure? Okay.
Awesome.
Who would have thought that?
You guys are going to ace this test, I'll tell you right now.
All right. So our machine size by default is a DS3V2.
Yeah.
And that gives you sufficient resources to do the compute piece. Now, from a storage piece, right now we're using standard storage.
Yep.
What you'll see, have we announced this yet?
I'm sorry?
Have we announced more?
No, we haven't announced.
Okay, so you're going to see some previews on some other types of storage that Zerto's going to support that I don't know if so it's not been announced yet, maybe. That's in Rob's session.
I'm looking for the product team. I don't see it.
Product team, anyone? Anyone attend the keynote? Did they bring up anything about this? All right, so I'm in a network security group right now. So who's worked with firewalls on-prem? Looks a whole lot like a firewall rule, right? Inbound, outbound, 100 through whatever number you want. So now we got that broken down. We got a compute, we got security,
Yep.
networking. So have we talked about networking?
Well, one thing I want to hop back to real quick is that, does everybody understand, and I'm taking this a step back just so you have a full understanding of everybody know what a subscription is? Okay, so in a subscription in Azure, okay, there's a couple different ways that subscriptions are created. When you go in and you create a free Azure account, you get a subscription, okay? And that subscription entitles you to use resources that are inside of Azure. Now, if your company has what they call an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, you have the ability to use something called the EA portal for Azure, which will be merged into the Azure portal, soon. But you can go into the EA portal and you can assign subscriptions to different people or different groups within your organization. But the thing to remember, though, is that subscriptions, okay, they are when you go in there, they are only allowed a certain set, okay, of objects and a certain number of VMs and a certain number of CPU cores, and there are all kinds of different limits that are placed within a subscription. All right, so that's kind of something you really have to remember, especially when you're dealing with a technology that you may be failing over into Azure. You may be failing, from one other public cloud to another public cloud. And when you start talking about the consumption and the number of VMs and things like that you're going to bring over, it's always good to understand what your limits are in your subscriptions.
Yeah, and I mean, even later on in one of our tips, we're saying go ahead and request more cores.
Yep.
Talk a little bit about the cores while we're here.
Sure. So when you talk about cores, you're talking about, when you get an instance size, you're given a certain number of CPU cores. You can go all the way down to an A0, which I think is like a quarter of a core or a half a core. I don't know how they do that.
It's a little fella.
But they give you like a half a core. But when you go up to the DS3V2, which we use, that's actually dual core. That's 2 cores, right?
Dual, I think.
Is it 2 or 4? I don't remember.
Yeah.
But as you pick a different instance, you get different CPU cores. Now, when you actually have a limit inside of Azure, you're only allowed, in a standard subscription, you're only allowed 20 cores. So if you think about that, if you had a bunch of those VMs deployed, you might hit that limit. And when you hit that limit, when you go to create another VM, it just fails. And it says, cannot create VM. Okay, so those are things you have to know about.
Yeah, and on a preemptive thing, we just go ahead and recommend, hey, if you're going to bomb out after what, 20 cores?
Yep.
Default. So go ahead and request to Microsoft. That's easy support request to their desk. They have a little core limit because it's a very common request. You just go ahead at the beginning of when you start on this. in request. You can, I think, go up to 250 cores before you got to get accounting involved and have a PO thing set up. They'll do a pay-as-you-go until you get to that number of cores, because you got to tie this back to that it actually is running on a machine somewhere, even though it's a virtual machine. It's in, Azure data centers, but we have requested certain amount of cores in certain regions, and they'll go, it's going to be a few days because we don't have any servers, in right now. So you can move to another region quickly and spin those up. But they have to do capacity planning on their side, and that helps them by the core request that you do. But it's a really simple request, and you don't have to use those cores. You can just request them and sort of let them know you might use them. Because if you imagine with what we do, you're going to have a running single ZCA most of the time with just using 2 to 4 cores, depending on the fall. And then all of a sudden, I've got VPGs that are going to go in and just go way past 20 very quickly. So that's part of that initial design that you got to consider. And I'll do a plug for tomorrow afternoon, last session of the day, AWS, with Amy back there. We're going to get into actually the public cloud planning much deeper. And some of the things are very common between the public cloud platforms of what to understand, such as, hey, they got core limits. You got to request that, and you need to have that sitting there for you when you start to do failover test, or you'll get errors. You're going to see the very common things on both sides. So we're going to go through that very deeper in that session.
One of the things I want to point out really quickly, though, is if many of you deal with multi-geolocation, so if you have locations that are located in other parts of the world, okay, not all the other parts of the world, those regions, carry all the same types of limits. All right, so US East, US West, have X amount, which we're going to show you. But then you can get into other regions like in China or in Tokyo. Their regions, their numbers change. Okay, so depending if you have customers or your enterprise that you're dealing in multi-geo locations, it's just good to know and plan for that. Not the region that you might have that customer in, or where they want to DR to or DR from, it might be different.
All right, so I think we covered compute,
Yep.
storage, networking, security, right? So it goes back to my on-prem data center. Those are the things I'm worried about, right? Okay, so let's see what it looks like. We've seen this in the Azure portal, and now I want to go over to the Zerto Cloud Appliance, go into VPGs, some that already exist. I'm going to edit one of them because I want to go over to the recovery.
Recovery, yep.
Yeah. So now we will see that what's Zerto consuming in Azure? VNet, subnet, network security group, and then the machine series, which is the things that we're used to begin with, right? So now I'm back to, that's what I got to have in Azure for Zerto to work with it. Need a VPN connection between it, and I'll show you a little bit later how we'll go ahead and build those things for you with the push of a button with a quick start template, okay? Any questions so far? We can pull the mics out and make sure we cover what we have so far. Question? Hang on just a second for the mic.
So if we replicate VMs to Azure, do we have to, and they're not powered on, do we have to pay for the resources like CPU and memory, or just for the storage?
You're paying for the ZCA. Go ahead, Mike.
No, go ahead.
You're paying for the ZCA, but then you're also paying for consumption.
Yeah, you're also paying for consumption. So you have to understand that when you actually put an appliance, any appliance, okay, not just Zerto's, but if you put any type of appliance or it's a marketplace image, you have to pay for not only if that has licensing tied to it, but you also have to pay for the consumption that appliance or that solution requires inside of Azure.
Yeah, and the replicated machines are going to blob storage.
Yeah, they're going to blob storage, which is really inexpensive. Yeah. So, yes, sir.
So, question here. You're showing the failover, basically the setup, but it doesn't say where it's failing to.
Actually, that is in the replication step.
Yep.
And it's going to the Azure site in this particular one. We could have this paired. I think this actual site is paired to multiple places, to Azure, another on-prem you know, it could be vSphere, Hyper-V, or AWS. You know, it could be any of the things we support, that whole multi-cloud thing. And depending on the target, it's going to look different in the recovery step.
So right now you're going Azure to Azure.
This is actually vSphere to Azure, but this recovery step is Azure specific. So if this were going to vSphere as the target, I'm going to see data center. I'm going to see the thing, you know, the storage and the things that I need for on-prem. So it's dynamic in that fashion that, you know, a VNet and a subnet wouldn't make any sense for you to see that in Hyper-V. Okay. Other questions?
Yep.
Over here. The mic is over here.
Way back here.
Oh, okay. We got.
Oh, wait.
Sorry.
I got one. I'm going to answer, and I'll repeat it. And it is, what was the question? Can I choose the resource group that it goes to? So when I'm doing a failover or failover test, the actual VPG gets a resource group created with that name, and then it also combines with what the settings are from the ZCA to get those settings as well. So you'll have a resource group with that name, and then that gets into VPG planning and all that stuff.
Yeah,
Question?
that was pretty much my question, was going to be, would you recommend deploying it within the same resource group as the backup targets, or a separate resource group? I know it's really doesn't matter that much. But.
Yeah, and it's really going to get back to the planning as well for the how you've laid out the recovery plan, which again is going to be in tomorrow's AWS session. We'll talk a lot about that actually.
We had to hold off. Okay, can we hold? Okay, because we have to get through some more slides, and then
Yep.
we'll
And
take one more question.
We'll take more questions. All right.
We're not taking another question right now.
So we can bounce over, Mike, to the
Okay,
slides.
this is a quick question. What is the ratio to protected VMs to VCA appliance? Is
To
there-
the ZCA, you're saying?
the ZCA, thank you.
So
yeah.
that, again, that is all dependent upon the, I'm sorry, I'm moving these slides up first.
That's fine.
Take it, Mike.
Right there.
Okay. Okay, so that has a lot to do with the performance of the actual on-prem. There's a lot of factors. IOPS, throughput, megabytes per second, the size of the ZCA. There's limits on the Azure side that you have to know, which Bing is what he's going to talk about some of them. But you have to model out that when you're doing the planning. Spreadsheet with all that information. Know what's happening on-prem first, because you need to know that in order to know how many ZCAs you're going to need, because one may not be enough depending on what the on-prem's doing.
The way I like to think about that is if you're doing a DR scenario to a co-location or to another physical data center and not to the cloud, you have to have some planning there, right? Because you're paying for what? You're paying for rack space, square footage, you're paying for power, right? And then you're paying maybe for the hardware. I don't know if you're doing that or not. But when you talk about actually working with the public cloud, you have to take that planning like times 10. And the reason is because there are so many more variables that involve, okay, in terms of understanding your consumption, like we were talking about, the IOPS, the disks, the things like that. It might be a little bit easier just to throw something into a data center or something like that. That, you know, up in the cloud, it's a little bit, it takes a little bit more planning. You know, a little bit more design, a little bit more architecture.
And also iterations. Just get your first group in, measure it to see if it matches what your planning was, as far as here's how many I think should be able to go. This is what the performance should look like. Then you're able to adjust incrementally as you go. And Mike's going to talk about limits and the architecture itself. What does it look like as far as the on-prem?
Right, right. So this is what I talked about a little bit earlier. These are some of the sample limits that Azure has around their, what they call their standard subscription. Now, there are subscriptions that you can get based off of being in government, being in or being an enterprise that has signed a little bit different agreement. All EAs can be done differently. But a standard subscription gets this. You know, your limits may vary. You need to consult your Microsoft licensing person, or go ahead and just go into your subscription and take a look. You can do that as well. Some of the key things here, the ones I pointed out, were the total cores per subscription. That one's kind of important. And then you actually number of VM per series, per core, okay, or cores per subscription. So if you think about that, you can only have so many in a series, okay, like a D series, in a subscription, in one subscription. Now, does that mean, you know, once you fill up a subscription, well, yes, you can ask for more, but you can also go to another subscription if you have that ability, right? Then you also get into storage accounts. Storage account capacity, 500 terabyte. You know, it varies when you ask for, you know, you say, hey, I need more storage. Microsoft will come back and say, okay, well, number one, why? Number two, how much? And number three, we're going to need to justify this. Okay, so they're a little bit more picky on storage than they are on CPUs or VMs. And the same thing when you get down to, you know, actual number of VNets in networking, the VNet peerings per VNet, and then the public IP addresses. You can use static IP addresses. I use dynamic in this sample. But when you think about it, if you only have 5 dynamic public IP addresses, you don't have a lot of options when you start putting VMs up that have public IPs. You know, you have to remember that you can only have that many, so you might have to scale back on that.
Yeah, one thing on the public IP, just to keep in mind, it is a bit of a different thing where it's a NIC with essentially 2 IPs assigned
Correct.
to it. A private one inside of,
Yep.
of Azure, and then a public
Publicly
one.
accessible,
Yeah.
yeah. So just real quick, some of you have already seen these slides. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to go through some key points, hint, hint, key points of the architecture, just so you have an idea of it. So when we look at this, we look at, you know, the ZVM and the VRAs on a production site. Pretty much everybody understands how that all works, right? But when we get in over to the Azure part, we're talking about the Azure region, which has a ZCA, which I'll explain in a minute if you don't know what a ZCA is. And then you have storage. Now, we do have, at that point, okay, we have the ZVM and VRAs, and then we need to configure the networking to Azure separately. All right, so that's when we have to start looking at either a VPN or an express route. If you're not familiar with, I think he talked about express route in the last one, I'm not sure. Yeah, he highlighted it, as a matter of fact. Express route is actually a dedicated connection, redundant dedicated connection, by the way. That's required by Microsoft. You can't have a single connection, it has to be redundant. So, you know, depending on how much your provider is, how much you pay, that's a dedicated connection right into Azure, okay? VPN, site-to-site VPN, basically just, you know, connecting a VPN device or a VPN server or however you do it up into Azure's VPN servers. Okay? What then we do is we look at the size of the VM in the marketplace. We have an all-in-one Zerto Cloud Appliance, which is a ZCA. Now, what the ZCA comprises of is on-prem folks, you know this, a ZVM, okay, which is a virtual manager. It also has the VRA in it. Okay, but it also has a VBA. How many people know what the VBA is? Virtual Backup Appliance. Okay, so that is the all-in-one appliance in the ZCA up in Azure. Okay. Then what we do on the VM side, block level, no snapshots or impact, of course. Always on replication, one-to-many, local and remote. One-to-many is kind of key for those of you who have not tried that yet. And then no recovery VMs until needed, obviously. We don't throw VMs out there. So key, okay, in Azure, you're not paying for that consumption, all right, for a VM on the recovery side. If you're doing it into Azure, you're not paying for that because all we're doing is putting it into storage, okay? Replica and journal and storage account and 7 to 10% overhead. And we do a VM, auto VM conversion. If you're going from a VMDK to a VHD, you know, we do that auto conversion for you. We are a scalable DR solution. Again, simultaneous local, RPO in seconds, VPN gateway. We can do, the key thing about this slide, I'm not going to go through all this, but the really key thing about this slide is the one-to-many replication. Notice how you can go between Azure to Azure, Azure to production site. Actually, you could add another one here and another one and have it go to this cloud provider site and go to this other data center that we have, so on and so forth. The other one I do want to talk about here is right in the corner, okay, which is how many of you use JFLR today? You know what JFLR is. Okay, JFLR, journal file level recovery. All right, So what that does is it allows you to recover files. All right, you know, just by going out and mounting a disk and picking a checkpoint and being able to recover any type of files or folders that you need to out of your VMs that are protected. All right, so JFLR is also available in Azure. All right, which now is available for Linux.
Yeah.
Okay. Any to any, Azure, this slide is just showing that you have the ability to go Azure to Azure and then back to on-premises. It's called the new intra-cloud, as we call it, but it is bi-directional. With a VPG, you can go up to 3 different, is that correct?
2 different locations,
Yep, 3 different locations.
which is really cool. If you haven't tried it out, you can go on-prem to on-prem, but then add in Azure and systematically get used to it, get comfortable with it. Still have your DR on-prem, but also be getting used to going to the cloud, and then you just cut over. It's very, very, very good.
Great. So then we're going to just quickly talk about how this actually performs the initial sync. And what do we have with a VM? We do a background process that Azure has. They call it an Azure Snap. We do a Delta bitmap sync with the target. We write the changes in the journal, and that heads over to the storage on the other side. This slide is pretty much going through the replication between resource groups. This is when we talked about the VNet peering. Okay, so when we were back a little bit earlier talking about VNet peering, this is what we were talking about, going Azure to Azure between VNets or between resource groups, between regions, if you want.
Makes things much more simple.
Yeah, yeah. Shannon's going to talk a little bit about deployment.
All right, so
Tell me the phrase about deployment, Shannon.
the what?
The phrase that we use about deployment.
It's something about simple.
Simple, really simple.
Oh, that's it. All right, so who knows that we have quick start templates in Azure?
Anybody use quick start templates?
That ought to be like extra points there. And did you see that? Some people sort of raises. Yeah, a little bit. All right, so let's go to Azure Quick Start Templates. And this one is, so right now we have 2. If you go to the Azure Quick Start Template repository in GitHub, which actually you can do this through custom deployment inside of the portal as well. But you just go right here, and what you're able to do is we've built a couple, and is Nava in here? She must be working the booth right now, but Nava is here, who helped tremendously. In fact, she wrote them for the most part. And so this first one I'll show you, actually the one I'll show you, because it's quick, is we're going to deploy to Azure. And what this is just a series. There's a JSON file which has the location parameters. You go in and you can customize those any way you want. And then what this is going to do is it's going to go to the Zerto Marketplace Appliance, the ZCA, and it's going to deploy it for you. And it's also going to have the networks and the stuff you need already there. So it'll get you going quickly.
We have 2 in there, though, don't we?
Yeah, and the second one is if you do if you want it to build the VPN for you, it will do that for you. So there's a second one that adds in an IPsec VPN, and it actually has the VPN gateway to where if you have the pre-shared key, it will actually, when it wakes up, it's connected. So that's a very helpful thing for you. This is where it goes. When I push the button on the Quick Start template, it just goes to your Azure portal, of which I was signed into. I pick what region I want to go to. Central's fine, East Asia. There's East US, and then I could create a new resource group, because it's going, okay, I need a resource group, and then where do you want it? And then what kind of account do you want to use? And then the rest is just username, password to meet the complex criteria. And then just a little description here of where it is. And then go down and accept the facts that they're not giving this to you. Purchase it, and it'll take off if I've not typed in something wrong. And it's just going to deploy the marketplace template. No, I don't want to save this forever on a shared environment. Okay, so that's deployment. And if we wait for a few minutes, we'll see it's deploying, and then it wakes up. It's giving me right now, if I go down through the list of things that's happening, it's created a network security group. Remember we talked about security groups, especially a firewall. It's already done the storage account that it needs. It's doing the VNet right now, and it's already given it a public IP address. It went ahead and grabbed one, and it's just waiting for everything to wake up to assign it. And that's kind of it. That's the deployment. Is that easy enough? Yes.
That's it.
That's great. Good. Okay. All right. Yeah. Woo. I got a woo out of it.
Yeah.
Now, once you're up and running in the ZCA, this is what it looks like. Who's never seen the ZCA UI before? See, we're at a Zerto conference, so
Yeah.
I was kind of thinking probably have seen this dashboard before. So there's who's not done a failover test before. So this is 201 level, folks. So we're there, right? All right, let's take some questions then. So I was going to do a failover test, but that's kind of redundant at this point. So go to the lab. If you haven't done the lab, you can deploy this the old-fashioned way, I say, by going to the marketplace and deploy it. So let's move back to the slides. We've got just a few minutes. Oh, yeah, that really simple thing you were talking about, Mike. I think we can demo it.
Yeah. So this is when we talk about where you can actually get our images from, but we want to go through a couple tips before we close out.
Yeah.
The biggest thing is request more cores. That requires a support ticket. You need to actually fill out a support ticket with Microsoft to do that. More VPGs with fewer VMs in the VPGs. Now these are just recommendations. Okay. You actually, go ahead and create VPGs, but make them with fewer VMs. Monitor the ZCA performance. This is really, really important. Yeah. You need to understand how the ZCA is performing in Azure.
Yeah, and one thing on the fewer VMs in the VPGs is simply because one of the VMs may be the one making the failover test take longer, or the failover take longer, because of the promotion process, which is the committing all that data through the journal into Azure, basically. So it takes a bit longer for the ones with high I/O rates. So you may have 10 VMs in a VPG, 9 of them are happy in 2 minutes, and then one of them's just taking a long time to commit the data, and it's holding up the entire VPG. So the thought behind that is, if you have fewer VMs in the VPG, it'll make failovers go faster for the most part, but you can monitor it and find out which one's the laggard, and you can still have plenty of VMs in a VPG if all of them are failing over, but not having so much of the I/O that is causing the one that takes longer. It impacts the entire VPG.
Right. On the ZCA performance, if you're not familiar with Azure Analytics, that's great to understand that. Plus, the other thing is that memory and CPU are really indicative of what's happening with that ZCA. Mm-hmm. So you really need to watch that and look at that. You should be doing that for your ZVMs as well, currently that are on premises.
Yeah, and even our DS3 v2 as the default for the template, you may find you go up a size and it just works faster for your environment. So there's this whole iteration that you want to go through when you're actually in deployment and you're monitoring it. You're going, if I bump this up a little bit, it cuts the recovery times over faster because it's just, it's a bigger machine. It can do it faster.
Right. You can scale out and up for constrained system resources. You can deploy another ZCA. There's really, no problem with that. You can upgrade the ZCA to a larger instance, like Shannon had said. Mm-hmm. One final thing is that when we talk about RTOs, they are longer than on-premises RTOs. Okay. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Shannon.
Yeah. So it's the whole concept behind, we're going to a public cloud, and the way that we're committing the changes into the public cloud is different than happens on premises. So even though the UI looks the same, it's a completely different architecture underneath that you're working with. So you just have to be aware of these things and know that where you could get away with certain things in on-premises and not really think about it as much, you have to think about it a little bit more with public cloud. And you can definitely tune these things and tweak them to where it meets your SLAs, and you'll find a sweet spot. But it takes time, care and feeding, particularly at the first, to get it to a point to where it's meeting your expectations and it's hitting your SLAs as you would like.
right? When you start actually getting into, like we say here, it's setting the expectation. So if you're dealing with customers or you're dealing with your own infrastructure, you need to set the expectation when you're going to public cloud. And this is for anything public cloud, really. But start at a little high point, a high watermark, and then it's great if you can over deliver, okay, and make that watermark go down. But you want to actually set that expectation right off the bat.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no reason to overpromise, underdeliver, as Mike said, because with the correct sequence of work, you'll get it where you need. All right, so we just talked about the demo. Everybody's seen the failover. So what we'll do now is there's a word that you must remember, and there it was, and now I'm going to move on.
Everybody get their cameras out right
That was
away.
mean, right? Oh, wait, they do evals for these? Yeah, oops.
Do we have any questions? We've only got about, I think, 5 minutes left, Aaron, right? Is that? Yeah, so if we have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm coming off the AWS end of my company using Zerto with AWS. And so from what I can tell from an Azure, you're taking away the Z importer, essentially.
Yes. Yeah, it's a
And
completely different
Completely
architecture.
different
Yeah.
thing. So I'm assuming that it reduces the amount of time for me to fail over.
It does.
It does.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are we talking like instantaneously, or are we talking less than 10 minutes?
No, it's going to be, if you're experiencing on premises of 5 minutes for a failover, let's say, it may be
Yeah.
20 minutes, something like that. It's certainly different experience than AWS. It's because of the Z importer you're talking about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
that's
a
astounding.
Thanks.
So, how do we do this? Can you hand the mic?
How do we how do we put the VMs in a specific VPGs? Is it based on the I/O? What do we do with the very high I/O VMs? Do we put them on their own VPGs or?
Typically,
Yeah.
and you may see instances where they go to their own ZCA. I mean, if it's a really, really heavy-duty high IOPS, what you're trying to do is you'll determine if it's not all Zerto, it's not all Azure. It's the blend of I've got this really high I/O thing going on, and I'm going across this bandwidth to the public cloud. So sometimes you need a dedicated ZCA for those. You may have to up-level them, and that's where those particular ones you want to spend a lot more time on iterations as far as what works best, because there's some of them that it's relatively low for a long time, and then it just burst for a while that gets you behind with the I/O, like SQL doing something. So again, that's where an on-premises one, you might not feel it as much as you would in the public cloud. But if you work with it, if it's a good candidate for public cloud at all, you can find the sweet spot.
Thank you.
We got about 2 minutes.
I'm running back there. Somebody back in the middle. I've already made
She's
the
like, she's like booking it.
Where was somebody in this room?
See Aaron run.
So we see a lot of people spinning up VMs, in Azure, and they all end up in their own resource group or storage account. And so with the ZCA, you can only replicate what's in a particular storage account. So if we have all these different VMs that are landing in their different resource groups, is there an instance where you have to spin up multiple ZCAs in order to access those VM disks?
Well, no, I mean, and I'm not exactly, well, it all depends on how you're architected, right? Because I have folks that I work with that literally have a resource group where they have 100 VMs, or they have a resource group that has 2 VMs, So yes, to a point that you need to understand from an architectural standpoint, you need to deploy that ZCA, because that ZCA, and correct me if I'm wrong, the ZCA crossing resource groups, okay, that's still not a thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're trying not to. So
Not yet. But
tomorrow's product section. You may want to go see.
but yes, today, you know, you need to architect that the right way.
Yeah.
You know, and I feel your pain because I know some folks that do that, especially when we're talking about things that have high I/O. You know, because they only put one VM inside of a resource group just for that purpose.
All right, we're at the bottom of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Hopefully, you pass your exam, your
Thank
cert
you.
test.